Hello, dear audience. Feast of Healthy Thoughts. We are continuing our conversations on a theme, and the topic is called resentment. At first, I didn't understand quite what resentment is and whether I have it in my life or not. But going through the days of preparation and being attentive to the environment around me, I realized that resentment is present in everybody's life, and especially in my life. And I have gone through a lot of it. And I want to share a story with you from Rachel Raymond. She has a book called My Grandfather's Blessings, which is a collection of very short stories. Each story is about 2 pages. And there is this one called Lot's Wife. As you probably know, Lot was a character from the Old Testament, and his wife was the character in the Old Testament who turned into a statue of salt because she was attached to the past. She turned and looked back. And God's commandment for them was not to look back while they lived the cities. And she looked back to the sin that was left behind, and she turned into a statue of salt. In the story, Raymond speaks about a woman who came to her for therapy. She said that this woman had lost her husband recently and she was in an obvious depression. She has a couple of sentences where she describes her very well. She says she looked as alive as the chair she was sitting on when she came, and her eyes looked as gray as her hair. Life had left this woman even though she was alive. And another expression she uses is that her daughter told Raymond that once her father died, she lost both parents. This woman had stopped taking her medication, and all she did was stand in front of the window and look out of the window to nothing. After a couple of therapy days, she starts telling the therapist about her anger towards her husband. How could he have left her alone in this world? And then she tells how loving he was when he was alive. Now she realizes that there are so many things that he had been taking care of, and now she has to do all these things alone. And then after the anger and resentment goes out of her, the therapist asks her whether she thinks what would her husband want for her at this moment. And then she starts talking about the love that he had and what would he suggest her to do. And once the love comes out, she gets better. And then after many years, Rachel Raymond receives a letter from her that she has joined this group who take care of older women or older persons who cannot take care of themselves. It means that the life returned to her and she started living her life. Dr. Fitzgerald is also a psychologist, and I think she has a lot of experience with this kind of persons who have resentments in their lives. Would you please describe what resentment is? I searched the web for resentment, and it seems like it's part of the grief that person lives, and at one point there has to be resentment.
It's a very good story that you shared to begin the topic of resentment. And you did 2 things. You reminded, at least for me, number 1, that resentment can be unhealthy. Lot's wife turning to stone, we maybe can even think about that in some way as a metaphor, articulating what resentment does to people. And also the second story, that resentment can also be part of a process for broken people who experience more brokenness in life and disappointments in life, where we are crushed by something. And we don't have to stay there, but it's part of the path, maybe even to be expected. And so I don't want to call it healthy resentment. I don't think resentment is ever healthy, but it's sometimes a necessary outcome of a tragedy, of a disappointment, of a loss, that as we get our wits about us, there might be a twinge of resentment, and then we go on, or we might have to work through weeks and months, maybe even years of resentment before we get to the next stage. And so resentment can be almost therapeutic if we look at it, if we allow it to help us ask the hard questions that keep us attached to the object of our resentment. And so, what is resentment? It's been called many things, harboring wrongs. Some people have called it wallowing, where we regurgitate, where we repeat over and over again, and sometimes in an obsessive way. There's not much new after a while. Dimensions of a relationship or of a consequence in life or a loss in life that leaves us feeling embittered and angry and less than what we had expected. Somehow we feel life owed us something different, or we were owed, or we were supposed to be one place and we wound up being in another place. We were supposed to have this kind of situation happening in our lives and we wind up having another kind of situation. I was supposed to be X, Y, and Z, and instead I wound up being A, B, and C. And so sometimes we're incredulous when that happens. Sometimes I can't believe it's happening. And other times, instead of being incredulous, we start to blame. We blame the other, or the others, whatever we think is stopping us or impeding us from what we thought was right. And so resentment can take a lot of our energy. Usually resentment doesn't hurt. That's one of the things that I noticed about resentment, either with my own resentments or with people that I'm dealing with. That includes the therapeutic resentment. It's a mixed thing for me to say that. It is part of the fall. We can talk about this theologically. It's not a good feeling to feel resentment. It's not a good, we're not in a good place. At the same time, it can become a tool for our growth, at best. At worst, we wind up pitching our tent there and living there the rest of our lives. And I know people in my own personal life, people who have come into my office and left, friends of friends and relatives of friends and my own relatives, where they can pitch their tent in the land of resentment and live there and become more and more toxic through the course of their lives, as they still feel empowered by the dynamic of their resentment. Resentment gives an energy. It gives us energy, and it sometimes can send an energy of bad will, of disdain. That's why resentment doesn't hurt so much. Resentment can give us a charge, so to speak, of our own self-righteousness. It's an expression of our own self-righteousness. Resentment doesn't hurt, at least on some level at first.
You're speaking about therapeutic aspect of resentment and also of the toxic aspect of resentment. How do you draw a line? How can someone recognize where in resentment are they? Are they in a place where they need resentment to get over their grief or their hard feelings, or they are living in that tent that you mentioned?
Thank you. That's a great question. The first thing is, the minute we recognize we're experiencing a kind of resentment, that we're holding on to resentment, that's a gift. Because it's almost as if our own subconscious, our own psyche, or God helping our own subconscious and psyche, making us aware, giving us a little mirror to look at our own processes. Because we can be high on our resentments, and it doesn't hurt. And we can live for a very long time, thank you very much, being resentful, and that gets us a lot of energy and can even propel us in certain directions that can be useful. That doesn't necessarily mean we become better people as we are being propelled to those new places, but God uses all of that, I just have to say. And so the second we realize that we are being resentful, we are feeling resentful, name it and say, okay, I'm being resentful, and ask, what am I really resentful of? Because sometimes we can just be resentful with the face of the issue, and there might be more. Where's the pain really coming from? And oftentimes there's a disappointment. Oftentimes there's a feeling of betrayal. Oftentimes there's a feeling of loss that, no one told me I'd blah, 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 blah. I would lose this, or this would happen, or I would gain this, or I would have to pay for this decision this way. If I had known, I would never have gone that direction or done this kind of a thing. And so once we start asking, okay, what's the resentment about? We enter more fully into our attachment to the issue. And once we name what that whole issue is, and that can take a while, it impels us to start looking at, okay, what was my part in this? Sometimes it's 50-50, and we never looked at our side before. Sometimes it's 90-10, or 99% the other party and 1% us. Even if it's 99-1, claiming the 1%, what's my side of the resentment. It's liberating. It's freeing both parties in ways that weren't free before. And sometimes when we're resentful, we get to a place where we really let go as much as we can. We take inventory on our side of the line as much as we can, and it's still kind of messy. And there we are forced to look at the whole situation, including our own selves, with the perspective of forgiveness. And remember, our previous discussions, our previous 2 episodes, were on forgiveness. And it was a discussion on forgiveness that led us into talking about resentment. And that's where we are invited by our own confusion to live and let live, so to speak, another 12-step slogan, which in the scriptures, that invite us to realize that we too are not without sin. We too are not able to cast the first stone toward a so-called guilty party, because we too have failed in our own lives, spiritually, morally, personally, psychologically even.
It takes 2 to have an argument. If it was only one party's fault, there wouldn't be any argument. And in resentment, what I understood from your explanation, there is a person who has resentment does not recognize that the misunderstanding or misfortune that has happened is not because of the other side. It's also our own fault. Now, when someone comes to you as a psychologist and has a lot of resentment, would it be helpful to help this person to understand their part, or you just have to let it go out?
That's a wonderful question, because I often see people in my private office, never mind my private life, who have lots of resentment. And I'm grateful when they come to me in my office if they name it, if they sit with it. And I ask them to name it fully. I ask them, they may or may not have a spiritual orientation, but they're coming to see me, they must trust me in some way or trust the relationship somehow. And so, usually, with respect and gentleness, and if I may add, with love, I ask the person to completely talk about what they're resentful about, and to name it fully, and to gently stay with them as they share their story, as they share what they're resentful about. And only after they've shared the whole story, they've shared the whole reason why they feel the way they feel, why they feel stuck, why they feel betrayed, why they feel, only then do we stay in that quiet place of, I'll say surrender on my side, but intentionally just to stay in that place with them when the person's done with their sharing their story, to see where we go from there, because there's always some place to go from there. What happens is when we have resentment and we're kind of high on that drive and high on our self-righteousness feels good. Self-righteousness feels like, I'm right, and I should be vindicated, and I should have revenge. And there might be a piece of that that's true, that people have been hurt, people have been violated, people have been oppressed, and that's real. At the same time, when we are high on our self-righteousness that fires up our resentment, that blocks the love of God entering our hearts in those same avenues, on the same roads or doors, so to speak, out of which that resentment is spewing. So we can't accept or acknowledge or receive more of God's love, more even God's help, when we're out there kind of doing God's work, trying to find revenge when revenge is God's.
What is the difference between anger and resentment? Is it just 2 terms for the same psychological feelings, or resentment is quite different than anger?
That's a good question. And I want you to think about it for yourself too, but I think anger and resentment are connected. At the same time, anger can be not connected from resentment. Remember, our feelings are a good thing. My husband and I had a long discussion the other day about emotions and emotionalism, and we were close friends with a priest who used to often spew ridicule at people he would say were too emotional. And I understand what that means. Sometimes we can let our initial feelings, our initial childish responses, which are human, rule, dominate, and not move through the rest of the experience. And when people are dominated by their initial reactions emotionally, They are childlike, maybe very manipulative and impulsive. And in a sense, spite their nose, they cut off their nose to spite their face, when they do not enter more deeply into what the emotions are really pointing toward. But I said to my husband, so emotionalism on that level, that priest and other clergy we know and friends have a right to be upset. At the same time, God gave us emotions. We are more than our emotions, but emotions give us information about things that are happening that are beyond them. And so they are, in a sense, a tool or a conduit to giving us data of important dimensions of life or life that we're dealing with. And so if we're feeling sad, if we're feeling loss, if we're feeling anger, there is a reason why we are feeling sad or loss or anger. And so we have to be completely transparent and even vulnerable with our own selves to ask ourselves, okay, what is it that I'm really angry about? And get to that. Now, oftentimes there might be issues of resentment there. Sometimes, there might be some overlap, but there's a lot of things that don't overlap. And so asking that question, what is angering me, can be very, very helpful at discerning issues and concerns that are even beyond that emotion of anger. Remember, our emotions lead us to deeper truths, deeper dimensions of truth in our walk toward God.
We read in the New Testament, love your enemies. This is the hardest commandment that has been given to the humanity, I think, ever. And even us Christians, I don't think, have been able to accomplish this in our lives, to love our enemies. As an Armenian, when I say enemies, I remember genocide. And for an Armenian to forgive the other party who has destroyed almost half of the nation, it's kind of impossible. In personal level also, when somebody has an enemy, anger is the only first thing that comes out, or resentment comes out. But on the other hand, this is what I would like to speak about. Sometimes we pretend that we love our enemies or pretend that we love the wrongdoers. In my life, this is what happens. Usually I try to take it in, and not name it, that this is happening, this is wrong, you shouldn't be doing this, you should be doing that, which could be done in a very calm atmosphere. But I take it in saying, oh, well, I have to be forgiveful, I have to be kind, I have to be nice. And after a certain period of time, it builds up and it will come out in a very impulsive way. I will name everything that has been done wrong throughout of the time. I think that's very wrong. But yet, in the process, I think that I'm experiencing or exercising my love towards somebody who is doing wrong.
You mentioned genocide.
Mm-hmm.
And you are Armenian. And in 1917, for those in our audience who don't know, the Armenian people suffered a cataclysmic loss at the hands of the Ottoman Turks. And we have to remember that it's not even 100 years since the genocide. It's not even 100 years. And I would say that when peoples experience this kind of catastrophe, it takes generations for that to process. And it's hard to remember because it's incredulous on a human level. We've talked about providence on this show many times, and how that even the genocide, that genocide, and other genocides, or the fall of Hagia Sophia, all of these losses cause us to temporarily, quote unquote, lose our way. We get blindsided. We forget about the providence of God. That we are in the midst of all this, still in the center of the palm of God's hand. How can I say this? I say this with fear and trepidation and with respect, that all of us are clay, specks of dust created in the image and likeness of God. We didn't create ourselves. And all of this life is a gift, and all of this is somehow, in our Christian theology and experience, leading us all back to Him in a way that respects free will, absolutely. And so hence, when humans conspire against other humans, we have cataclysmic catastrophes like genocide and other types of terrible things. And so it's less than 100 years since the Armenian genocide. And one of the issues that I think friends of mine who have been wrestling with this, who are of either Armenian background or who are Orthodox Christian. And I'm part of a group called St. Catherine's Vision. We have published 2 books, both titled Encountering Women of Faith, Volume 1 and Volume 2. In Volume 2, there is a chapter written by Barbara Harris, a woman who finished Holy Cross Greek Orthodox Theological School a number of years ago, studying the life of St. Barbara, her patron saint, which led her into friendship with Armenian Orthodox Christians that she's met, that reminded her of her own saint story, and then she did a whole study on the Armenian genocide in a way that tried to be fair to both sides, but especially the Orthodox Christian Armenian side. And after naming all the facts, or as she's naming all the facts, she's realizing, as the reader realizes, that even this, Christians are urged to forgive. And so what does it mean to forgive when people have been massacred in this way? And when generations of people are in denial that this ever happened, or that, well, something happened, but it wasn't that bad to begin with, and that people are being deliberately fed or led away from the real facts so as to keep denying the problem. And so Barbara's chapter in our book still says forgive, and forgive with one's eyes open, trusting God. And so in the end, her chapter becomes, and I would urge people to read the chapter, so I'm not seen here as moralizing or inappropriately summarizing someone else's work. But in the end, she also uses examples from Christian history and the works of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who talks about what does it look like in our contemporary life for peoples to forgive each other unconditionally. And he wrestles with that, and he's helping that work today on the African continent in ways that's giving life to many people from across the political spectrum in his native homeland. And so I think we, as Orthodox Christians, are beginning to ask more profound questions in what does it mean to acknowledge, and what does it mean to survive? What does it mean to notice our own resentments? And then how do we move forward in a way that does not deny one eyelash of the abuse that occurred, and at the same time turn our attention to the love of the living God, who himself is the solution to this.
In this situation, 2 types of resentment that a human being can have. One towards each other, because this tragedy happened, I'm very resentful against that person who did it. And the resentment can be also against God. Why did this happen? Why did God allow this happen? We spoke a few episodes before this about Saint Macrina that was taken off her route because her younger brother died. And now a champion like her was knocked off the horse by the grief. And she probably lived resentment too at one point. What do you think about this? How can this affect human psychology or human spirituality?
First of all, God is a good and benevolent God who loves humankind. And we pray that phrase over and over again for centuries as Orthodox Christians in many of our services. And so if God is a good and benevolent God who loves humankind, then he understands what it's like for us from the inside out. He knows us, he reads us, and he sees our pain, and he sees our confusion, and he sees our bitterness, and he's very long-suffering. If we believe God became human so that the human person can become divine, then he can tough out some of our childish, childlike, and genuine resentments toward him that hopefully will lead us to a deeper relationship with him. And so when we are resentful, when we are angry at God, turn that into a prayer. That can be a prayer. That's the beginning of a conversation on a deeper level. Why did you do this? Sometimes I tell my friends and people who see me in my office, I'm quoting a psychologist. She would sometimes say, asking why is to die. 90% of the time. So some of those why questions is basically based on our anger, and it's like trying to figure out the numerical letter pi. You know, it goes on 3 point into infinity. So that kind of asking why is to die. At the same time, it's okay to ask why in a light-handed way and ask, how do I manage from here? Where do I go from here? Help. Help. And see what happens.
So in that situation, we have two kinds of understanding. We have a blame that is blind and it blocks our vision. And then we have question. Why? We love God still. Even though this happened, we don't understand why it happened, and we're asking a question to understand.
We can even be angry with God. We think that if we are angry with God, we don't love God. No, people can be angry toward each other and still love each other. We don't get that message too often, as long as we don't try to intentionally harm the other. And it's hard sometimes living with the anger in the room when you love the person and trying to bear witness to both in an honest way. At the same time, that why can also be partially blaming. It's guilt through the question. Why did you do this? When we ask why in that way, we are not asking ourselves, did I have anything to do with this? And sometimes, no, we don't have anything to do with this. The tsunami came in and ruined my whole day because it ruined my whole country. I didn't have much to do with that. Who knows, indirectly, but I had nothing to do with it directly. And so these kinds of things happen. And there are other circumstances that occur where we might have had a tiny connection, or a medium-sized connection, or a larger connection. And it's still important to ask, what is my side of this? And the blaming, the accusing, tends to die out when we start asking these honest questions. We don't like being powerless. When I'm blaming, I'm powerful. I have power to say, je t'accuse, I accuse you, you're bad. And I'm taking sort of a temporarily godlike, self-righteous position, and, judge, jury, and executioner, saying, this is wrong, this should be happening. And all of us go there, I would think. Anybody that's human and over age 4 has been here at least a few times. And so sometimes on a human level we need to go through that. God understands that. And it's a way of working one tiny step past the denial, just to name it because we're incredulous. At the same time, we can't live there because it's childish.
Many times I have noticed when this happens to me, after the anger or resentment or blame has come out, or the judgment against the other person, then I start looking back to it. Like when somebody is drunk, I have heard that the next day is the worst day when they have the hangover, because they can feel how bad it was yesterday.
Start getting addicted and then the hangovers are less, but that's another story. But
when this angerful expression leaves you, you start looking at it more authentically, saying, I shouldn't have done that. And then you start feeling bad, and then you start recognizing your faults. That's what happens to me when I express myself wrongly or impulsively. Then I have the hangover of that anger. Do you think that that's the helpful counterpoint of our...
I think so. I think that's part of the process. I think, let's say we have that little blame game going on, and sometimes very big, sometimes very small, and then the next day we wake up and we kind of feel bad about the whole thing. Sometimes because we're not God, because we are finite, because we are made of clay, specks of dust created in the image and likeness of God, all these dynamics, our clayness, our finiteness, our fallenness, our desire to grow in eternal love with God are all, they're all clashing at the same time in our confusion over this. And so sometimes a little time, a good night's sleep or two, helps bring us back to our senses. How many times in the scriptures do we hear when Jesus heals someone, they are brought back to their senses? Well, in a sense, sleeping on it or having some time away from the initial impact helps us come back to our senses. And then we see the senselessness of our overreaction, that it was just spitting against the wind, so to speak. And then we're left with that, oftentimes, that sadness, that emptiness, that now what feeling. And that's not a bad place to sort of be aware and to notice, to name, and to pick up the 500-pound phone. A, in prayer to God, and B, to talk it through with someone you love and respect.
You mentioned about being addicted, and I don't think it's accidental that you made that comment. Thinking of sin, recently I have had this vision or image in front of my eyes that it's something that plugs the pipe that connects us to God. And we don't want to clean that pipe because the dirty water will fall on us. And once we start cleaning it, after going through embarrassment or whatever of our sins, then we can start enjoying that pure relationship with God. Now, when you said, unless the person gets addicted to this, do you think that, for example, that I still experience that aftermath of my anger, and I feel bad about it, it means that my relationship with myself hasn't been plugged yet so badly that I can still feel bad about what I did. But there is a point where a person will go on blaming and angry and accusing and living the resentment and never even think about it later. Do you think there is that kind of situation?
Absolutely.
Also?
And when we're there, sometimes that's still temporary, that we sometimes need to be there for a while, because sometimes when people have been oppressed or abused, I'll say humans, if we have been so oppressed or so abused that our humanity is not even acknowledged. And if we're in that state for a long time, just to be able to say, I've been hurt, I've been wronged, this is wrong, this is unacceptable, was a luxury we were not entitled to have when we were in the midst of the oppression, when we were in the midst of being abused. If someone is a piece of you-know-what and has no right to speak and has no right to think, just do what I tell you or else, you don't have time to think about truly who you are, truly, and what is your real mission in life, because you're too busy trying to survive. And so once people are past that place of immediate survival, they come to another place where they can start saying, I've been hurt, I've been wronged. And so maybe what you're saying as the place of resentment, it might be resentment. I sometimes talk about whining with an H, as Jesus said when his fatigue. Foxes have their dens and birds have their nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. His desire for compassionate connection and rest, he too whined a little bit in a way that tells us something about what it means to be human on this planet. And so when people are not Jesus and they are suffering through the regular ups and downs of life or through an extra weight they have to carry, getting to a place where things are a little bit more safe, sometimes the first thing one does is just start coalescing and naming the sin, and you need to stay there for a while and to be angry. And that's not bad. It's saying, I feel, I have responsibilities I need to attend to that I wasn't allowed to, or I have a voice that I wasn't allowed to use, I have a heart I wasn't allowed to cultivate because I was told I was somebody else. And so that time in the presence of God, as we Christians would say, a time is needed to just sort of hang out there in the presence of God, just to name who you are, to find your truer voice, because you were told who you were. And so that can take a while. At the same time, there will come a time, and we've said this before, where, okay, I know this, I'm done, I need to move on. And there are many people we know and love who choose not to summon up the courage and ask the questions of where do I go next? How do I go next? Who do I talk to go to the next place in my life? Unfortunately, there are many people we might care about who refuse to move on because this is an improvement. And thank you very much. I think I'll stay here. You go on without me. But that's sad because they're missing out on perhaps a far richer life.
Would you tell us a little bit about resentment against our own selves? Sometimes some people will fall into blaming of themselves all the time for everything. This is kind of like the unhealthy part of recognizing one's own sins. When in all kind of relationships, we always think it was our fault. We blew it, we messed it up, and I'm so stupid, I do this all the time. And things like this we always say. And this happens, I think, most of the time with children who have grown up in addictive families, where they haven't been recognized for their goodness, or they have always been careful with being right or doing the right thing.
There's healthy self-esteem, and then there's idolatry of self. And sometimes what's called healthy self-esteem is idolatry of self, meaning it's all about me, and I won't feel guilty about certain things. That's old-fashioned. I just need to be successful and pursue my goals, and very little compassion is cultivated in that person's heart for the other in their lives. You're not talking about that. You're talking about persons who, for some reason, are hypercritical in their conscience toward their own selves. And that often comes from what happens in addicted households or dysfunctional households where people are raised in a dearth of love and authentic connecting with one another. And to boot, on top of that, those of us who are striving to walk a spiritual path, who feel commitment to grow in this and share whatever good comes from that, and if some of us have gone on for more work in seminary, we learn of the ancient Christian disciplines of daily self-examination, of needing to review everything you've said, everything you've thought, everything you've done, at least once a day at the end of the day as part of your evening prayer rule, if not more often. And what usually happens when people are hypercritical is when we look at our behaviors and our thoughts and our feelings for the day, there's a kind of self-blame that is annihilating. It's a kind of, we turn the blame on ourselves, the shame on ourselves, that I am no good, I am junk. God doesn't make junk, but we feel like junk. We feel even self-destructive by the sins that we do. Now, sin is sin, or mistakes that we make are mistakes. We're human bits of clay created in the image and likeness of God. At the same time, when we are hypercritical in this way, we are really listening to voices that are antithetical to the love of God. We could even say voices that serve evil. Because if you think of evil, and we often use the word for evil referring to the evil one, the cunning one, oponiros, which is one phrase from the scriptures referring to the evil one, or diabolos for Satan. The Greek word diabolos, which is the Greek foundation for the word diabolical in English, really means one who separates that which separates from the will, all right, ivuli, the will, the holy will of God. So if God's will is complete and whole, then the evil comes in to cut it and to separate it and to smash it, cut away from it. And so when we are doing our fearless moral inventory, and instead of it encouraging us and having courage, instead our moral inventory that we do at the end of the day crushes us. That's not of God. Fallen, cheapskate human beings, bullies, act like that. But God doesn't need to act like that.
It's interesting that you mentioned about the evil one. When I was finding quotes from the scriptures about the resentment, I found few from Job. The long-suffering character in the Old Testament is the image for Christ. What we see in his entire life, the evil is the one who causes all the sufferings that he goes through. And the reason is to make him to resent against God, to get angry against God. And he keeps talking to God. So this gives me two images. One is that he never recognizes that there is someone else that is causing this. He's talking to God and trying to understand what's going on with himself. What's his fault? Why is this happening to him? And the other thing is that he does not pay attention to the third one. Maybe he knows that whatever it is there, but he does not want to deal with him. He wants to keep his connection with God. Somebody has asked me, why would a child die? How can you explain this from the Christian perspective? How can you explain this by the love of God? They had an agenda of asking this question, but that's not the point. The point is, what I answered was, everything happens by the will of God. We cannot explain it, but it happens by the will of God. And also my second thought was that sometimes we forget that besides God, we live in the presence of evil also. And that can be done by the evil to make us jump off the route. And sometimes we don't pay attention to this. When something bad happens to us, to our loved ones, our attention goes either to the people around us, whose fault was this, or it goes to God. Why did you allow this to happen? What would you say about this? How can...
Well,
we have a balance.
This could be another conversation. It should be sometime another conversation. Just focusing on this. At the same time, what might be easier and still equally true and less cumbersome for a follower of Christ, and I think for people generally who respect what we're talking about, is that God respects free will. And so when evil happens, people can make evil choices. And there are laws of nature that God does not get in the way of, even though He rules nature. How that happens, I don't know. And so God may allow bad things to happen, that He's never absent from the processes. For all the persons involved, He's still there. And He allows these phenomena to occur out of absolute respect for free will. And that's the closest I can say right now while we're together on this from an Orthodox perspective, before we go into a whole different discussion on it, that it might be better to think about what is God's love, God's loving intention for a particular situation, as opposed to focusing on the evil one. One of the things we've mentioned in the past, and I'll say it now, just in case this is someone's first time listening to our conversations, is when we are dealing with good and bad, or good and evil in our everyday lives, it's really important to name what we believe the evil is, and to name it fully. And then, once that's done, we turn our coldest side of our body, our backside, to it, and we face God, we face the truth, and we proceed from there. We might talk to someone about it, maybe we pray, we talk to someone about it, we maybe do some kind of action, because to ignore and not name the bad or the evil that's happening feeds it. To stay and obsess about the bad and the evil feeds it. You don't feed it when you name it fully because you've exposed it, and then you turn your backside to it, and then you search for the good, you walk toward the good, and sometimes it inspires us or leads us to action, immediate action, or a response so that we grow in the good, feed the good, make choices that build on the good, and not pay attention to the evil unless we need to because something new has come up. But this also connects in another way to the issue of resentments, because when we sit down and we think about our resentment or resentments, maybe there might come a time when we have the gift of asking, okay, what do our resentments teach us about us? Because where your heart lies, there your treasure lies also. So if my resentments are more aimed at success, financial success, professional success, popularity, sometimes my resentments teach me a little bit more about where my real priorities are, where my heart really lies. And sometimes that's not pretty.
Even that way, resentment is kind of a good thing because it becomes our teacher.
Exactly.
It shows where we are and where we have to go.
Oh, I hate when I do it though. So, okay, God, but it is helpful and it is freeing, and I don't look at those, I don't like those parts when I see them in myself of where my resentments are. But then, after a while, when you do this for a while, you can start saying, okay, God, we can laugh at ourselves. There I go again. Mm-hmm. So it's more compassionate. Paradoxically, we can even look at our resentments. They don't rule us. They just inform us about our clayness and our fallenness. And again, name them and then turn to God and be open.
Thank you, Presbyter. This was wonderful. And we will continue during our next conversation. We have only a few minutes left, and I would like to conclude here and thank you again. And I want to thank our audience for being part of our conversation, and we'll see you next time.